Welcome to Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. A world where coming in second place is not an option, but where principle-centered winning is the only approach.
Good morning and welcome to Government Contracting Weekly. I'm your host, Hilary Fordwich. Our regular viewers know that winning government contracts is at the heart of Government Contracting Weekly. That's why I'm especially excited about the discussion today that centers on the subject of procurement. Joining me this morning is Roger Waldron, President for the Coalition for Government Procurement. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning, Hilary.
Thank you for coming in. And also Angela Stiles, Partner and Head of Government Contracting for the Government Contracting Group at Crowell & Moring. Good morning, Angela.
Good morning.
And also David Drabkin. He's the Corporate Director of Contracts at Northrop Grumman. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Hilary.
And also to Bill Gormley. He's the President of the Gormley Group. Good morning.
Good morning.
We have great panels this morning, particularly on the topic of procurement, so let's get right to it. And I'd love to give our audience a little bit of background about each of you. Many of our members of our audience may know you already, but Roger, maybe you'd like to share with us a bit about your background, because you've been in government and you bring a spectrum of both sides to the table.
Yes, well, I worked for the General Services Administration for about 20 years.
GSA,
the GSA, General Services Administration, for about 20 years, and 15 of those in the Office of General Counsel, and then a couple years in operations and a couple years in procurement policy. Spent about 4 years working for a law firm, advising government contractors on procurement issues and contracting disputes. And for the last 3 years, I've been the President of the Coalition for Government Procurement.
Super. And Angela, also, you've been at OFPP. You have both sides of the aisle, too.
I do.
Yes.
I've been practicing law for over 20 years now, but I was fortunate enough to spend some time in the federal government at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. But I also worked in state government and on the Hill for a while as well.
Yeah, so you have that well-rounded background, too. And David, you also now at Northrop Grumman.
Yes, I started out with the federal government in the Army JAG Corps. I was a civilian attorney with the Army in Europe, and then with the Defense Logistics Agency, and then the Deputy Program Manager for the Pentagon Renovation, and then I went to GSA and spent 10 years where I retired after being the Deputy Chief Acquisition Officer and the Senior Procurement Executive, and having spent a short time on the Hill with the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee.
So that great background. And Bill, also, you have too.
Yes, I have over 30 years acquisition in government. So I've been a contracting officer, so I've actually walked the walk, retired, been in industry, ran a couple small businesses, sold those, and started another small business. So very, very familiar with the acquisition community.
Great. And so what I love for our audience is that there's probably nothing you guys don't know about procurement. We've got lots of wealth of expertise here. So I'd like to ask you about something that's top of mind for all government contractors, particularly in this era of austerity, and that is best price. Who is getting the best price? What is the best price? And when somebody said to me recently, you know, price to win, no, who would price to lose anyway? But what exactly is best price? Where's it going? And what do you see is the impact on government contractors? Roger, let's start with you.
Best price focuses right now in the government contracts context. It seems to me the government's focused on strategic sourcing as an avenue to achieve best price. It's one of those things that changes day to day, frankly. It depends on the requirements. It depends on clear articulation of requirements, and it depends on many factors in the private sector too, time of year, market conditions. Are you pricing to aggressively try to get into a market you haven't been in before? There's many, many variables that go into best price, and I don't think there's one answer to what it is.
What do you think, Angela? Is there one answer?
Well, I think it's a code word for sharpen your pencils. It's a code word for figure out how to be more efficient and figure out how to lower your profit margin, because the government's facing some significant fiscal constraints and they expect the contractors to come in with lower prices.
And it's not going to go away, right? No. So from the contractor perspective, David.
Well, first of all, I think I'd like to change the discussion slightly to best value, which is really the term we use, and best value is a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is low price, technically acceptable.
LPTA, yeah.
And on the other end of that spectrum is technical trade-offs. And somewhere in the middle, or at either end, depending on what you're buying, is the right price that the government customer should pay. And the difficulty is defining what your requirement is so you know what the right price is to pay for the thing you're buying.
And what are you advising, Bill, on the right price?
Best price?
Yes.
Everybody wants it, nobody gets it.
No one gets it.
So I think that's the important thing. I think in many cases, I think to the panels, some of the comments here is that the government's shooting more on that, towards that point, and I think to David's point also is that best value is getting lost in the conversation. And at the end of the day, it's a loss to the government. But it's the same objective in industry. Everybody wants to get the best price or best value. I think the value is a key factor here.
So what about strategic sourcing in that? For anybody in the audience that wants to get into strategic sourcing?
I think strategic sourcing, as some of the panel members I'm sure are going to pick up as well,
yeah.
it's a hot item right now, and everybody's talking it from the Hill, from an operational standpoint. But I think at the end of the day, and from a commercial standpoint, you have to have requirements, defined requirements for strategic sourcing. And even strategic sourcing is not going to give you best price, and I think that's important.
That's important, and you're probably advising your clients on that too. And
that's
yes.
exactly right. I mean, I think the hard part about strategic sourcing is it's hard in the private sector. The private sector doesn't know how to do strategic sourcing well. What you have to think about is it's reducing your number of suppliers and giving them more volume. And so the hope is that if you give them more volume, they can lower their prices. The particular suppliers can. It's very, very hard to do in the private sector, and the government's not doing it well either.
Right, right. And your Crowell and Moore clients are coming to you for that kind of advice too in those arenas, I would
Absolutely.
imagine. Yes,
I mean,
they need you.
There are winners and there are a lot of losers in strategic sourcing, and that's the problem, is that a lot of companies that have done a great deal of business with the government in the past can't do business anymore because of strategic sourcing.
And that same thing you're seeing
that's
for your members.
That should be a long-term concern for the taxpayer, for the federal government, because what you're doing is you're reducing your supplier base. And that reduces competition. I think in the long run that will increase costs for the government. There needs to be a focus on requirements development at the agency level. There's too much of this overarching, generic approach to strategic sourcing and talk of mandatory use, which mandatory use is code word for I can't figure out my requirements, so I'm going to make everybody buy off a particular contract. It's much more effective to look at requirements. And one other thing I'll just mention, that David mentioned best value and best price.
The right price.
Yeah, price. Well, nobody wants to do low price technically acceptable for cybersecurity, for example, right? It's about cost technical trade-offs and finding the right quality and the right price to perform.
Mm-hmm. But I also think that when we get into strategic sourcing, the way it's evaluated currently is the savings. It comes from what the price difference was from what it was to when they awarded it. There is a total cost of strategic sourcing, and I think from an industry standpoint, they're going to look at what the total cost is to have strategic sourcing, not just a unit price reduction. And I think the government needs to look at what is this costing the government in total cost to see if there's a total savings.
Yeah, and as Angela said, it's never going to go up. They're not only going to say, oh, we think you can actually now increase your numbers just because we've got more money. It's never going to.
Take issue just a little bit with what Angela said. In the private sector, we do know how to do strategic sourcing, and we've been working on strategic sourcing in terms of our supply chain for years. It's also how we're going to address the counterfeit parts problem and how that's affected. But strategic sourcing includes developing a relationship with your vendor supply chain. And the government, because of its own rules, has a difficulty establishing a relationship with their supply chain because as competition is defined by SECA, they seem to think they have to go out and recompete something every year or every couple of years.
Right. Is this something that the government should be addressing more? And can you dive into it for our audience about contract duplication?
Yeah, from a commercial item or products acquisition side, there's way too many contracts in government. And from the government's perspective, I think one of the ways they view it is do they have too many contracts? They'll say, well, why is industry responding if it's a duplication? Industry has to respond. It's like they have to respond from a business standpoint. So
it's a waste for everybody. The government loses and industry loses. Everyone.
With sequestration, this should be a key item. It's an easy way to reduce it. As things expire, OFPP should not allow things to continue where there's duplication.
Yeah, it's lose-lose for everybody, isn't it, David?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, a lot of people don't understand that it costs money for a company to bid on a contract.
time, energy,
but it costs,
hours.
It costs real money, and
yeah.
that's money they can't use to bid on other contracts. And it'll also, if they can't bid on another contract, it reduces the competition, as Bill said. The real issue on contract duplication is management across the enterprise of government, and OFPP has yet to take up the mantle of managing these IDIQ contracts across the enterprise of government.
That's right, yes. And IDIQs and duplication of contracts, Angela, a lot are there to help your clients with.
Well, I think the problem is, particularly from an OMB perspective, is that you have 20 children, and all the children want a different contract vehicle because they all think they're very special. And that makes it so hard. Every agency is not special in terms of how they need to buy, what they need to buy. And that really is ultimately the problem, is you have to reduce, whether it's an IDIQ contract or GWAcs, you can't have companies having to bid and bid and bid because they're spending money, and ultimately that raises the cost of the federal government as well.
So streamlining is there's masses that could go.
Yes.
Contract duplication is a cost to all parties, government and industry, and it's a cost that none can afford at this point, especially with sequestration, the budget profile that we face. There's great opportunities for savings in federal procurement if there's a focus on and sort of a strategic acquisition approach to procurement, looking across the federal enterprise, emphasizing pre-existing contract programs, and particularly programs that are government-wide, whether it's the IT GWAcs or the GSA schedules. There's opportunities. You can literally buy, most agencies can buy everything they need off of pre-existing contracts instead of creating new ones.
But they still do, like Angela said. They all do, and they all think that they're unique. Yeah, and that isn't good for anybody's lose-lose situation. So what about GWAcs? What is the vote? Jump in. What do you think about GWAcs? Are they good? Are they bad?
Well, GWAcs were the invention of the Clear-Cohen Act, which was passed in '97. And the idea behind those was to take away the then monopoly that GSA had over the purchases of what was then called ADP. The object of that exercise was to create a number of government-wide contracts that every agency could use to obtain their requirements. There are actually only a few GWAcs left. When we talk about contract duplication, it's not in the GWAC world, it's in the multiple award IDIQ, multiple agency IDIQs, even single agency IDIQs. The GWACs themselves aren't a problem, and probably a very good thing, and should be perpetuated.
Are you seeing that with your clients at Crowell and Mooring, Angela? Do they feel that they're good?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I guess the problem ultimately is there are many requirements that have been put on them by Congress and by the regulations which don't make them very much different than any other contract vehicle at this point in time, from whether it's protest to actually having to get on the GWAC and then also bid again for particular RFPs or RFQs.
Yes, do you see that, Roger?
Well, I want to focus on another piece of it that that goes to contract duplication is, look, these IT GWACs have to go through a business case analysis. They have to be vetted across the federal procurement community, and they ultimately have to be approved by OMB.
Right, yes.
So if you've got a contract program that's gone through all this process that OMB has blessed, then the question becomes, why do agencies feel compelled to create their own vehicles because they're unique, or why do they put in place all these internal procedures that restrict their ability to use these contract vehicles when OMB has blessed it and said it's, this is a sound program?
And we really need streamlining, because time is money always, on any side, government side or industry side.
But, to Roger's point, that when you have the GWACs and then people are creating other contract vehicles, there's a lot of contracts that have been awarded out there. To an earlier point that you brought up on duplication, a lot of companies have contracts that have zero sales as a result. So there's a significant amount of overlap.
Yes.
So even on the government's point, why are they spending the money doing contract administration or industry? To David's earlier point, the cost of actually getting a contract is a lot of money on both sides.
And time is money always.
Zero sales.
So an IDIQ. So is an IDIQ a hunting license, and is an IDIQs working?
Well, I mean, IDIQs are what typically are called hunting license. The schedules program is what's typically called a hunting license. But yes, in fact, that's what they are. You get an IDIQ and you get a relatively small guarantee of business, a very small guarantee. And then, as Bill pointed out, there are a lot of these contracts where companies get no business. But you open the segment with another point. Why do companies bid on these contracts if they're not in favor of them? And the answer is, if you don't know where your customer is going to go,
you have to be in the arena.
You have to be where your government customer may go, so you wind up compelled to bid on things which you would not otherwise bid on.
Yeah,
And many
right.
of them are for a period of time, so you have to bid. So it's a 5-year period of time.
Otherwise you're locked out, basically.
One on-ramp, and
Yes.
otherwise you're locked out. Now,
Yeah.
I will say that the government, many agencies have started to be more flexible on some of them, and for the larger ones are providing additional on-ramps later in time, particularly when they're high-tech, particularly when they're looking at green initiatives where the technology is changing a lot over time. They recognize that you need an on-ramp and you need off-ramps.
Okay.
Another aspect of those contracts, these IDIQs, the big ones that are multiple award, is the costs to compete and submit a proposal and be evaluated and get on those are significantly high when the real competition's at the order level. The government needs to focus on emphasizing competition at the order level.
That's right. Order levels across the board. So we're hearing that bid protests are sort of de rigueur these days. There's a tremendous increase in them. And Bill, are they good for anyone?
Well, I think from an industry standpoint, they have to do it. I mean, because with sequestration in front of everyone, the pie, still a large pie in government from a market standpoint, but the pie is smaller. In order for a company to maintain their slice of the pie, that slice has to get larger. So from their standpoint, when they feel that the evaluations haven't been done from a fair standpoint or hadn't been vetted well, they have to protest.
They have to protest, and it's also that they also want to almost extend their incumbency.
Well,
I mean, I think that's part of the strategy, isn't it, nowadays?
Well, I'm sure that could be part of that. There's no question. But on the other hand, I think at the end of the day, industry is trying to do what's right from their stakeholder standpoint.
Yeah, and
just like
defend their
government.
ground.
And defend it,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes, what from Northrop Grumman?
Well, first of all, we don't like to protest. We don't like to sue our customer, and that's just not something we like to do. And in fact, I think you'd find we do it very infrequently. But protests as a whole, first of all, are not a huge problem. There were about 2,700, was it, protests this past year, a little more than that. Back in 1991, there were 2,700 protests, and there was only $150 billion worth of work.
Now that's interesting, because you hear so much more
billion.
about them. You weren't hearing about them in the 90s. That's interesting. Angela, are you seeing an increase? And especially from Crowell and Mooring, because that's something that you do.
We have not necessarily seen an increase in them. I think they become more important to companies. The larger the procurements are, the more important one particular procurement will be to a large company or even particularly to a small company.
So maybe that's why
when
there's
it's
been more
fed to
publicity
company.
about them, yes.
But it's a critical aspect of maintaining the confidence in our procurement system. You have to have a way for a contractor that thinks that something has gone wrong in the evaluation to be able to object to that. And you have to have that level of confidence for the taxpayers and for the contractors that are doing business with the government.
Roger.
And with regard to protest, you really have to look at and segment the market. The bigger the procurement, the more obviously the more likely the stakes are higher, the more likely you'll have a protest. But the government literally does hundreds of thousands of transactions every year. And as David mentioned, you're talking about 2,700 protests.
So it's minuscule, really. In the big picture, it's just the publicity, really, then. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an aspect of it, but I also fundamentally agree with Angela that it plays a positive role. I use the word positive, a positive role in the process. It provides an opportunity,
said too, yeah,
a check and balance in the process. That it's like we refer to it as like the private attorney general. It's an opportunity to object to a government process. And provides a fundamental aspect of transparency to that procurement process.
So there's transparency. The other thing, the issue that's become kind of big is the sort of reverse auctions. And there's the kind of contention that are these just shaving margins? David, shaving margins?
Reverse auctions have their role in the procurement tool bag. And we've gone through this before. Back in the late 90s, we had a big push on reverse auctions. But the role of a reverse auction, it's not every nail. I'm sorry, not everything you got to do to attach something to the wall requires a nail. Sometimes it requires a screw, sometimes it requires a staple. And what happens is people like reverse auctions, and then they start using them for everything where it doesn't make sense.
Not applicable in that instance, yes.
That's like strategic sourcing, David. We're going to strategic source everything, and it's not applicable.
Well, the problem with reverse auctions is that people will bid too low in order to win, and they won't really be able to maintain that. And you will have a critical supplier who has bid too low, who can no longer maintain that price and will go out of business. And you can't then get the parts that you need to perform whatever it is that you're doing. So there's a really significant financial aspect to reverse auctions that the government doesn't always consider when they're doing them.
And particularly with the younger procurement team, they don't see that. They wouldn't see that down the road because they haven't been through that or experienced that.
But I think it has a very very major negative impact on small business. And from a socioeconomic standpoint, when you do reverse auctions, that clearly is going to have a major impact on small businesses across this nation.
Yeah,
in a
small
negative
businesses
way.
are suffering.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And what gets lost in this conversation about processes, whether it's strategic sourcing, or reverse auctions, is it gets back fundamentally, in my view, to requirements. And the government's ability to articulate requirements in a manner that gets you, maybe not the best price, but the best price at that moment in time for those in the market for those particular requirements.
And I think a lot of
That's
people
what
forget.
David said, right price. Yes,
I think
Andrew.
people a lot of forget that contractors they should have a profit. I mean, it's not about.
No
like,
one's going to be
going
doing
out
government contracting a decade from now if there aren't any profits.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
But I think a lot of contracting officers forget that in the process, is that, contractors do need to have a profit in order to continue to be your contractor.
To be in business.
But that goes back to choosing where you use reverse auctions.
Yeah, your point.
If you're buying a COTS item off the shelf, and there's
a
no other
commodity.
requirements other than a COTS item, reverse auction makes sense. And by the way, contractors aren't going to sell you their television sets at a loss. They know what the number is, and they'll bid whatever that is, and that's how. But that's where a reverse auction makes sense. When you're doing a reverse auction to try to buy something that hasn't been done before, or to buy a complicated service, I mean, that just doesn't make sense. And how do you know in the end, as the contracting officer who's buying it, that the company that you just accepted the lowest bid from on the reverse auction actually can deliver what it is you want and not going to wind up having you go out and do it again?
That's exactly right. As our regular viewers know, we always like to address the keys to winning. The force behind Government Contracting Weekly is Key Solutions that provide strategy, capture, and proposal support services, all to help government contractors win. So we want to talk about the keys to winning. Our audience wants to know how to win, and David, with Northrop Grumman certainly knows how to win. What does Northrop Grumman see as the keys to winning?
Well, first you have to understand your customer and know what your customer needs. That takes you to understanding the requirement, which many contractors sometimes really don't understand the requirements. At Northrop Grumman, we spend a great deal of time understanding the requirements. And then next, you've got to offer an affordable solution, one that meets their requirements, sometimes gives them additional capabilities, but also is affordable in the sense that it'll be within their budget and within what they anticipated they were going to spend. And finally,
as you said, the right price.
Right.
Yeah.
And then finally, you've got to deliver. And although you're talking about capturing, but the way you capture is you deliver the last time you work for a particular customer, and they know that you're reliable and can deliver. That's all that goes into actually the key to winning.
Mm-hmm. Angela, your clients need to win.
Absolutely. I think you have to really think outside the box these days. You have to lower your costs, and to do that, you have to think of different ways to do it. Get tax incentives, go to the state government, go to the local government. If you're an important employer in a particular base, go figure out a way that you can reduce your costs so you could reduce the price to the federal government.
So you're more competitive. You're giving the government what they want, which is the right price.
Find out how to be more competitive.
Yes.
And that, with that in mind also, if you have a solution that you can powerfully articulate how you're going to save the government customer money, that's going to put you ahead of the game. And I've heard a lot about talk about knowing the customer. You need to know your contracts too, right?
Yes.
We've talked about
Be compliant.
Right, but not just that, but we've talked about contract duplication here.
Oh, yes.
And multiple contracts. Understanding, frankly, the capability of the contract that you have, it will help you in, basically when you're talking to the customer, is there a GWAC that can meet their requirements, where they could compete the requirement and where you're strongly positioned? Is there other contract vehicles that, are tailored to a particular set of requirements? You have to understand your portfolio as well.
Right. Bill, you have clients as well with the Gormley Group, so they want to grow, and you need to grow.
Exactly. I think from the standpoint of what everyone's indicated here, I think in addition to that, there's a flow down to this. So where there's partners that you need, make sure those partners are quality partners that you have to deal with and have that relationship. And to be honest with you, a lot of folks who have who bring in, as a prime, they'll bring in subcontractors or partners with them, and to kind of create a little issue here. A lot of primes don't use their subs. And so I think here that if you have a good track record, then that adds to you as far as past performance and so forth in regards to responding to new procurements.
And that's where you can shave costs. That's actually what they want. So what do you, Angela, when all of your clients, you're actually advising them on things they haven't thought of already. You're finding other ways when you start thinking out of the box. So they come to Crowell & Mooring for something that's different than they've already thought of too.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
it may be an aspect, a legal aspect that's different. It may be tax incentives that are different. It may be, you know, really helping
You
them.
get creative with them.
Right.
Yeah.
It's helping them think through how you become more efficient as a company as well. Can you help from a legal perspective? What other things have other companies done to become more efficient so that they can be more competitive in the government marketplace?
So you're really looking at the best practices and saying, look, no, you're doing this, but this is what we're seeing across government contractors with the depth of clients you have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you have the depth of membership, Roger, so you can do the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. There's opportunities to engage in networking and understanding and learning about potential partners. And I think, you know, for small businesses especially, it's, you know, there's a big focus on small opportunities for small businesses in the current administration, and those set-asides still provide teaming opportunities for large businesses, and fundamentally, to the extent it's a service requirement, you're typically going to have a team. And small businesses.
To Bill's point about
exactly.
making sure you utilize the subcontract as well.
So you have to understand the market that you're in and your competitors and the capabilities of people who could be part of your team.
And so that goes to David, a question I'd love to ask you because our audience always wants to know. So we get a lot of requests for this. A lot of the audience members are also small businesses. They want to know how to team. How do they team with Northrop Grumman to win?
Well, actually, Northrop Grumman is very proud of the fact that we have a diverse supply chain and a diverse base, and we focus a lot of time and attention on that. And back to a government customer's requirements, a lot of people often forget that those requirements go beyond just the thing they want to buy, but also how you sell it to them.
That's exactly right. How they sell, and that's what our show is about. How do you win? And that brings us to the kind of the final moments of the show. So I'm so grateful that you all came in this morning and joined us here with our audience. And thank you very much for each one of you. Bill Gormley is the president of the Gormley Group. Thank you to you. Thank you, Bill, for coming in. David Drabkin, the corporate director of contracts for Northrop Grumman. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And also to Angela Stiles. She's the partner and the head of the government contracting group at Crowell & Mooring, global law firm.
Thank you.
And last but not least, certainly to Roger Waldron. He's the president for the Coalition of Government Procurement. Thank you, Roger, this morning.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you to all of you. And also, as always, we like to make this part of your Sunday morning. So thank you for making this part of your learning experience. And we hope to see you next week.
My name is Chris Colo. I'm the president and CEO of Micropact, and I watch Government Contracting Weekly every Sunday. I tape it. In fact, I have 4 kids running around all the time, so I like to watch it whenever I have an opportunity. And it really provides me a lot of great insight, being able to see my peers in the government contracting community, and also be able to hear the trends and happenings regarding government contracting from straight from the horse's mouth, from government officials. You know, it certainly helps me when I'm making decisions within the organization, as I use a lot of the information and data that I receive from Government Contracting Weekly to make the decisions that I make every single day.
You've been watching Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored each week by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. For additional information, comments, questions, or suggestions, please write us at governmentcontractingweekly.com.